Welcome to Demon Folklorist. I'm your host, Victoria J., and as you've probably pieced together, I'm the Demon Folklorist. So far, I'm the only one that exists, but I hope my work reaches other budding folklorists who have an interest in demons. Salem, my little black cat, is currently asleep at my feet, and he's also the mascot for my website. Also, just black cats are awesome, just saying. Let's get into it. So folklore is the study of stories we tell, and I specialized in the supernatural in my master's degree, but I also have an interest in fairy tales. So this is going to be a folklore episode. I'll be doing either horror movies, folklore, or demon episodes, sometimes a mix of two or even all three, because those are the three things that I happen to care about. Folklore has been interested in fairy tales for a long time, since the Grimm brothers began collecting folklore. From there, fairy tales have been classified by the Arne-Thompson-Uther Index to trace their origins, similarities, and differences. Today we're going to be talking about the many different reincarnations of Snow White that have shown up in film. And there's actually a new one coming up. I'm not going to talk about this one, but I do find it awesome that Snow White is kind of coming back. We're going to get into the reasons as to why that could be. If you've ever read anything by the Brothers Grimm, you'll know that it's a lot. Cannibalism, death, hot dancing shoes, cutting parts of yourself off, all sorts of fun stuff. But I think these dark versions are meant to appeal to adults through their childhood memories. Horror movies play with this a lot. Like if you think about clowns or dolls, things that we completely enjoyed as children that are now weird to us as adults. Snow White was first popularized by the Brothers Grimm in the 19th century. The seven dwarfs didn't have a name until a play named them, and then Disney renamed them again. Snow White was also a much younger girl in the original. They called her Little Snow White because she was about 7 years old. The evil queen in the original eats what she thinks is Snow's liver and lungs because she was tricked by the huntsman, who was hired to take Little Snow White into the woods and kill her. The evil queen wanting her heart was a much later invention. And then this whole ingestion of organs thing to become the utmost beauty reminds me a lot of the neon demon because they took that motif and made it very real. What they were going for is that this town is going to eat you and spit you right back up. But it was in a very literal way, so that was a lot. And nobody really saw that coming, I feel like. So it also made it worse. And then Snow White also gets dropped from her coffin, just full on dropped, and it Heimlichs the poisoned apple out of her mouth, so no kiss from the creeper prince. The evil queen was also murdered via wetting by wearing hot iron shoes, and she danced until she died. When you're trying to identify the fairy tale being used, it's usually by motifs, or tiny pieces of the story that give away what type of fairy tale this is. We understand that this is a Snow White story because her hair is black as the raven, or ebony, her lips are red as a rose, and her skin is as pale as snow, which totally sounds like a vampire to me, but I digress. We have the poisoned apple, obsessed with one's own beauty, growing old while another blooms in front of you, children as rivals, which I think is completely weird. I would never compare myself to somebody way younger than me, but whatever. Jealousy, magic, woman rescued by a man twice in her life, the huntsman and then the prince. This sleep representing lovely, sweet women to the point of complete passivity, which is probably at the time what women were thought to be. I hope we have moved on from that because women are badasses. Snow White wasn't really one of my favorites growing up. I thought it was a little too similar to Sleeping Beauty. I think that later as an adult, I enjoyed the idea of this perpetual sleep because I don't get enough sleep as an adult. And it just sounds nice. But we also have this evil queen figure, the long sleep, the prince. It basically seems like the same story. Add in, she looks different and there are some dwarfs. And there you go. We're mostly going to be focusing on the 1997 Snow White, A Tale of Terror, because we got a lot more insight into the evil queen, who had been largely dismissed and uncharacterized until then. She was a backdrop villain in the original Disney movie, and I'm going to just be honest, I hated the Disney movie. Her voice gets on my nerves. But I do appreciate it because it was really the first animated movie, and it is iconic, even if I didn't really like Snow White herself. And then there's also this running theme of incestual weirdness between the queen and her brother whenever a brother is put in the story. So in A Tale of Terror, we do have the brother, and there's this moment where you're like, is something happening here? Because it's weirding me out. Probably not, but it's almost like they're implying, like, yeah, she's so evil, she's sleeping with her brother, or she did at some point in time. And it's like, okay, those two things aren't related. We're mostly going to be focusing on this version because I was really rooting for the evil queen. I don't normally root for the villain, but sometimes they're a lot more compelling than the heroine. She had everything going against her, though she tried very hard to be a good wife and mother. In this version, her name is Claudia, and she becomes the new Lady Hoffman when the original dies giving birth to Snow White. And the way the original Lady Hoffman died was so hardcore. She had her husband cut her out of her body while she still lived. So that's how Snow White was born. Friedrich is the husband. He's whatever Hoffman. I didn't quite catch it. But he's very important in this storied landscape. Probably Germany. I'm not really sure. But he was very subtly cruel to his new wife about the previous Lady Hoffman. It got reinforced to Claudia over and over and over again that she would never measure up. Snow White is called Lily in this, and she was a little shit from the start. By the time she grew the hell up, it was too late. There was a very heartfelt apology that she gave to Claudia, but by that point, my real question was, if you were really the grown-up that you thought you were, this would have come much earlier. So we have Claudia living in Lady Hoffman's shadow, by those who remember her, plus Claudia actually being in love with Friedrich, who always held a part of himself back, plus trying so hard with Lily only to be continually rejected, plus the final straw, the only child she would ever bear being stillborn after 9 years of trying. Sounds like a recipe for a supervillain if you ask me, because how far can one person really be pushed? Claudia is also a practicing witch passed down from her piece of work mother, and the way she talks about her son to the mirror, giving life to her beauty as he grows, it makes me think her magic is actually quite predatory. I think it's using her son and siphoning his life force to keep her beautiful. The mirror also seems to call to Claudia when she's at her lowest, so it makes it seductive and pushes her to use very dark magic. Implies she's supposed to murder Friedrich to bring her son back to life. Death is pretty much like the end. So when you're using magic, and necromancy is what that's called, to bring back someone from the dead, it never turns out well. There's also like an incubus thing happening somewhere in there. I found it fascinating that she didn't quite understand that it was her magic who was kind of ruining her life, not Lily, because Claudia becomes hyper-focused on killing Lily, and she fails several times. She ends up getting her through a disguise, through this poisoned apple, like we know, and that doesn't last. She focuses entirely on her own beauty. This is Claudia I'm talking about. Because in society at the time, it was how you were noticed and recognized as a woman. This comes up in later reincarnations as well. I personally found the queen to be the most interesting facet of the continuing stories. Her motives, though they were wrapped up in her looks, it was really about power or selfishness in general, and it makes the 30s evil queen feel very shallow in comparison. Then in 2001, we had Snow White, the fairest of them all. This was part of my childhood. I actually do remember Tale of Terror on the racks, although I never actually rented it, probably because it was rated R, first of all, and second of all, I'm not sure I really wanted to taint the way that I viewed Snow White, which was through this movie's lens. Fairest is gorgeous in its design, but as an adult, it feels like a really weird fever dream. I can't watch it all the way through. And I used to rent it constantly as a child because it was a really great design playground for a child's mind. So many bright, beautiful colors and intricate costuming and all sorts of fun stuff. But now I'm just kind of like, this is weird. I gotta turn this off. In 2007, we have Sydney White. And I actually really enjoy this version because it's calling out classism and cliquey behavior, saying that we need to include everybody, that we shouldn't be putting the rich and usually famous in some way or another up on this pedestal when other people exist and their interests are valid. I feel like we've come a lot farther than we were at in 2007 with this idea of like nerds and fandoms, all that sort of thing. I also liked how Sydney was beautiful, but she was also completely herself, and she didn't want to starve herself to be beautiful, which body standards, the way that they are, nobody should be starving themselves, and nobody should be comparing themselves to other people. But unfortunately, this does happen. I did like how Sydney was like, I don't need to be one or the other to fit in. I am myself, and if you don't like it, that's your problem. In 2011, we got Once Upon a Time, which gave the storyline that this wasn't as stupid as it had been originally about looks and about rivalry. This was about revenge, because Snow White, when she was a little girl, accidentally got the evil Queen Regina's love of her life killed. Now, it was Regina's mother, Cora, who actually killed her prince, or he wasn't really her prince, but he was like the stable boy, I think. But Snow White ended up telling Cora about it because Cora tricked it out of her. Instead of blaming her totally murdery mother, she was like, oh, I'm just gonna go after this little girl, who ends up growing up, of course. That's when she extracts her revenge. I just thought it was weird that it's like, hey, I'm gonna hyper focus on this little girl who was a little girl at the time, and of course she was gonna be tricked by someone much smarter and bigger. 2012 was interesting because we saw 4 different remakes in that same year, so it makes you wonder, like, what was going on in 2012 or the preceding years that would call people back to this particular fairy tale. The bigger productions had a comedy and then a darker story, and they were just released at the same time. I remember thinking, why do we have so many Snow White movies? What's that about? What I personally think it was about is that this was a response to millennials reaching adulthood, because I was 18 years old in 2012. There were a lot of anxieties from the previous generations about their kids growing up. Parents began to be able to process their feelings about being bested by their own offspring. So Snow White is really a story about the resentment of your progeny and youth being wasted on the young. There was also Mirror Mirror. I enjoyed this one because it was lighthearted with lovely designs. It was done by Tarsem Singh, who I sincerely hope I am saying his name right. If I'm not, I'm so sorry, sir. He did The Cell, which is a very dark, very interesting movie that goes deep into the mind of a serial killer, and it uses modern art to do it. So it was interesting to see how he used his very detailed, very different perspective on a comedy about Snow White. I thought it also was beautiful. It poked fun at itself as a genre. It told women that they didn't need to cower in fear when they could use their mind to fight their oppressors, which feels like a comment on vanity. Vanity isn't really going to get you super far. I mean, the queen was a little bit less evil the way we think of it, although she was totally evil. She was more deviously selfish to the point of ruin, and she even narrated her point of view in the beginning, though this didn't happen perpetually throughout the story. It had Armie Hammer in it, and ever since the cannibal thing, I just have trouble watching him. Also, he seemed way too old for her. So it mildly creeped me out even before we knew he was a cannibal. Same year, Snow White and the Huntsman. Now, Charlize Theron plays Ravenna, who is a very strong villain. She had a beautiful, dark imagery, and her reasoning isn't completely crazy. I mean, she says that she believes men use women, especially queens, and then replace them with younger models who are the epitome of youth and beauty, that those two things are the only paths to power. And especially at this time period, she was probably right. So she was consumed with rage and obsession with her vanity, which to her equaled power. She also had a backstory of living in poverty. So she used what she had and then magic that she later gained to get what she wanted. And then a king at one point, as she explained to this new king that she seduced and killed, there was a king who ruined me and he replaced me. It showed her what men are really like. Now, this is not a comment on every single man. It's more like a lot of men are like this, and it seems very common in our culture to have men go through midlife crises and sleep with someone much younger because they make them feel young. Not going to get into that super deeply, but it's something to think about. Why is that happening? Something I noticed was the runes on her magic mirror. They indicate Norse magic. Kristen Stewart wasn't a very strong or likable Snow White. I don't think she was old enough for this role. I happen to love Kristen Stewart, especially after Underwater. I was like, yes, love her. But this didn't seem like the role for her, and I don't like to sit here and bash people or even movies because they tried. And you know what? I'll give her credit for that. I don't feel it achieved its end goal. There are feelings of aging women and sexual rivalry happening here. Also, just this idea of trying to stay young forever makes it difficult for Snow White to get anywhere, right? Because Ravenna wants to stay queen. So she's violating natural order. She's going to continue living and Snow White will never inherit anything. And in this one, she is imprisoned beneath the castle. If you think about like the original story, Snow White was like 7. Okay, she was not a sexual rival for this queen, and yet she took all these steps because, oh my gosh, she's prettier than me, which at the time meant she was going to take my power. That doesn't really make any sense. She was 7. The mirror also isn't usually a huge part of the story, but it is a powerful item that advises evil queens in their dark ways. Who doesn't know the line, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? We also have 3s going on in the original tale, so 3 drops of blood from the queen's hand, 3 queens, the original queen, the stepmother, and Snow herself, 3 plans by the evil queen, and 3 days of mourning by dwarves before her burial, which just... why would you do that? Like, why would you wait 3 days to bury her? Bodies decompose very fast. That's not a good idea. I know this because I worked in a funeral home. You got to keep that thing on ice if you want it to continue. Otherwise, like, if she was dead, she would have been decomposing. So clearly it was like a magical sleep. And we also have this almost Goldilocks like just right narrative in fairy tales because of the 3s. So it's not this first one, it's not the second one, it's this third one that finally moves the plot forward because that's how we think. We think in narratives of 3. It comes up a lot in mythology, too. Then a question I had was, should we be sanitizing the originals? I think kids are fascinated by both sets of tales because it's easy to identify the villains, and the good guys always win. I'm not sure it makes a ton of difference, since kids seem to love super grim fairy tales and then the innocent ones, too. I understand trying to protect one's kids from the darker side of nature, of humans, of the world. My only real issue is not explaining about happily ever afters. It somehow confers the idea that life is fair, which it isn't. The bad guys do sometimes win, but I like to think that defeat is always momentary. Thank you, King Kong, for that wisdom. 2003, Peter Jackson. It was great. I think it was 2003. I hope so. Fairy tales are recycled from childhood to explain ourselves and society during various parts of our life. They find new life on streaming services probably because of their ability to bring comfort. Oh yes, I remember this story. You know which story this is and you know how it ends. There's no stress there. There's no anxiety. This is actually really common for people who suffer from anxiety, me included. We like to watch things that we know how it's going to end. We don't have to get attached to new characters. We don't have to watch somebody die. We know what's going on. We can't seem to let go of this particular set of stories, nor should we, sanitized or not, because I think they're good for children and then later adults to think with. We need them, so we breathe new life into these reincarnations of the same tales. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Demon Folklorist.